recent years and decades have seen millennials, or Gen Y, dissected and discussed ad nauseum by leaders around the world. However, 2020 was a significant transition point in the generational discussion because it was the dawn of what's now being referred to as the post-millennial era. This doesn't mean that millennials are no longer an important group to focus on from a strategy perspective. However, what it does mean is that there is a new generation, a new group that are hot on their heels that we cannot afford to ignore. This group, called Generation Z or Generation Z, began graduating from university and college in 2020, and they're a significant group to watch. After all, they are your future workforce and your future customers. Now, defined loosely as the group born between the mid-1990s and the early 2010s, Gen Z or Gen Z make up almost 35% of the global population, and they wield a combined spending power of $143 billion. By 2030, they'll also be 31% of our labour market. Like every generation before them, Gen Zs or Gen Zs are defined by a unique youth culture and set of attitudes. In this video, I just want to look really quickly at 3 characteristics of this group that are essential to understand as we gear up for the next generation coming through. Number 1, this is a generation who are values driven. Having grown up in an era where society has been dominated by the focus on climate change and the prioritization of sustainability and the push for gender equity, these things are now core elements of Gen Z or Gen Z's identity and value set. These personal values are translating to the economic decisions that this young group are making in some really significant ways. For instance, research indicates that 73% of younger consumers are willing to pay more for products or services that are sustainably sourced. Now, as an indication of just how significant this trend is, Etsy spent $1.62 billion in June 2021 to buy the second-hand fashion app Depop. Now, Depop is a favorite for Gen Z or Gen Z, and it taps into their desire to make sustainable and environmentally sensitive purchases. Now, there is no way that Etsy would have forked out a sum this big to purchase Depop unless they were pretty sure that this app and the trend that it represented was the way of the future. And there is a lesson in this for every business or every brand. Now, in a professional context, a similar commitment to values is evident. For instance, Gen Z or Gen Z claim that they are more driven by meaning than money, with almost 2/3 of them, so 65%, saying they'd prefer to do something of significance rather than merely earn a big pay packet. All right, number 2, a second characteristic of this young group is that they are selectively authentic, which is a term that you might find a bit strange, but go with me here. The very nature of what gets cut through and engagement with Gen Z or Gen Z can often seem baffling to brands and organizations. The rule of thumb is that messaging and content needs to appear authentic, raw, and self-deprecating if it's going to gain the attention and the engagement of younger consumers. However, there is something strangely paradoxical about Gen Z or Gen Z's approach to authenticity, especially in terms of how they present themselves online. And this is a really significant theme. Now, one of the chief complaints that young people often have about older generations relates to their lack of, raw authenticity, especially at work in a professional context, but also online. To this point, a study conducted by Coefficient Capital in 2021 asked people from different generations when they felt most like themselves. Was it online or in the real world? Now, predictably, older generations said they felt far more like themselves in an offline world than they do in a digital environment. However, get this, for millennials and Gen Z or Gen Z, it was a very different story. In fact, slightly higher numbers of Gen Zs said they actually felt more like themselves online than they do in the real world. Now, while there are numerous ways to read this data, it is hard to overstate the significance of this fact, because here's the interesting thing. Gen Zs actually put a lot of time and a lot of energy and effort into appearing real and authentic, especially online. For instance, I love this little graphic that I saw on social media that speaks to this very theme. Of all the good and the bad things that happen in life, it's only a small and very curated snapshot of reality that actually gets shared, particularly in a digital environment. This generation's concept of authenticity may seem, paradoxical or even a little bit ironic, but the desire for realness is something that every brand and leader must keep front of mind. The third characteristic of Generation Z or Generation Z relates to their obsession with social media. Now, to understand this young group and how to engage them, the first place we must start is where this generation or this cohort are congregating, especially online. To this point, up on the screen behind me here are 6 of the apps that a whole lot of Gen Z or Gen Z are using most frequently right now, particularly the teenage cohort of this group. And I wonder how many of them you actually know. This might be the moment you start to feel a little bit old perhaps as you look at this list and you mainly know 1 or 2 of these apps up on the screen. Now, in case you're a bit in the dark, here are the names of these apps, and I'd encourage you to get to know and understand them. Because the reality is, these are the apps that this generation are on, and this is fueling their addiction to and their engagement with social media. And we've got to be mindful too that these apps are the hot thing right now for Gen Z or Gen Z. It may change in a few years' time, but this is where it's at right now. Now, if we just look at number 1 on the list here, just look at TikTok. The growth of popularity of TikTok amongst Gen Zs is an enormously significant trend in and of itself. For instance, the amount of time that Gen Z spend on TikTok eclipsed their use of YouTube, and on average, TikTok's 1 billion users spend 24 hours viewing content on the platform every single month. Now, in addition to understanding the social platforms this group are addicted to, it's also important to understand the language that they're using online. Now, up on the screen behind me are some of the more common emojis that Gen Z use when they're chatting with each other. And as you look at those, I wonder if you can guess what these emojis mean. Now, if you're anything like me, as a millennial, I always think the 1 second from the top is like if someone's got a cold or allergies. Or the 1 second from the bottom there I use as one of my default smiley emojis, or at least I did, until I realized what this emoji means if you're from this Generation Z cohort. Up on the screen behind me is what these emojis actually mean. Now, I don't know why that means extreme passive aggression, that 1 second from the bottom, but it's important to know that because you could very easily be miscommunicating with this group and have no idea at all. Now, the way Gen Z or Gen Z are communicating and collaborating in a professional context is also differing significantly. Now, research conducted by a consulting firm named Creative Strategies looked at this whole theme of how different generations communicate and the role that social media is playing in the way this young group connect in a workplace setting. And they actually looked at the over 30s. And how do the over 30s want to communicate? Number 1, Outlook. Email was the first way that people reach each other if you're over the age of 30. Now you compare that with the under 30s, the Generation Z cohort. Look at where Outlook is. It was actually the lowest on the list. Very, very different approach. Now, while millennials will continue to make their presence known for many years to come, it is time for leaders and organizations to recognize the opportunities that their younger cousins, Generation Z or Generation Z, represent. This cashed up and engaged young group are buying different things in different ways and for different reasons. Businesses that ignore or underestimate this change will do so at their peril.